it would be a clear arrogance and a limited undertaking to think that I can adequately express a diverse understanding of the notion of trauma on a social media post in a short video clip. Yet, from personal experience, there is a clear way of expressing a subjective offering into the modern trend towards describing life's difficulties as traumatic. So trauma is, in fact, a subjective term and has become increasingly so. But objectively, we now have terms like global trauma. The current plague or pandemic is a good example of that, or the more recent plague, we might call it now. And then there is generational trauma, that which is passed on to us through family, through culture, and through the human experience, the endemic human wound that we've carried with us. But the trauma word and our understanding of trauma as we work in trauma-informed ways and trauma-informed environments is certainly having a renaissance, is having its day. We even live in a time where insufficient likes on a social media post, I do not mean this one, are globally understood to be traumatizing events for certain individuals, certainly for our younger people. In this, we've surely gone awry, or there's another indicator of the ways in which we've gone awry as a human endeavor, as the human experiment, the human experience, the collective conscious moves forward into and through and with and as a digital age, that we have people that would be traumatized and end up in therapeutic patterns and spiritual patterns as a result of the plans for life not working out, not meeting out, as a result of feeling unloved and unliked by the nature of how they present themselves in a fake forum or in a anti-social forum, we might say. Social media is in fact the opposite of that. It is the creation of a version of ourselves that is muted, that is in flux, but is also muted and is ever developing, just as our actual understanding of who we are and our sense of self and how we project ourselves into the outside world. We've neatly made it into an online endeavour, and trauma has always been something that happens in the body-mind, as the Eastern philosophies call it, or that leaves its resonance in the body. Trauma is essentially the experience of knowing difficult events, experiencing difficult patterns and cycles of pain and suffering that leave their resonance within the body, within the mind, within the psyche itself. Addiction is a really good example of traumatizing events. Here in the UK, we had a national outpouring of grief at the loss of a princess who died in a car crash, Diana, some years ago, as the nation was given an opportunity by a collective event, by a common experience, or perception at least of having a common experience. There's always a common experience. We live as a nation, we live as a species in a common experience, but we overlook that as we vie for visibility and esteem over each other. Yet there's a coming together in times of difficulty and trauma that affect us as a species, as a nation, as a global community. And this was the death of the princess in the car crash, of course, as people joined together in the street in unpacking personal suffering and grief that was neatly nullified and neatly limited by the ways in which we are unable to articulate grief and are unable as a species quite often to know the language of grief and know how to attend to the descent into suffering and tears and expose ourselves to the difficulties of loss and letting go and endings. And we suppress that and we reject that and we avoid that, which of course is all to not do any of those things, which is to just neatly obscure that until a point that it is triggered in us by yet further traumatizing events. Yeah, it is fundamentally good that we are evolving our understanding of trauma and what that is, but we need to keep our eye on how we articulate that. We look at the consequences of difficult events. Maybe a child is told no for the first time. Maybe a child goes to school and is disciplined for the first time. Maybe a child is in the home and is disciplined. This is not to say these are not difficult and challenging events, but we must explore whether these are, excuse me, deeply traumatizing. There is the inherent fall from grace. There is the loss of innocence in childhood that we must have. We must move from that sense of seeing the world as a safe place, as a minor, that we do when we would approach any stranger and say, you know, why have you got no hair? Why is your leg missing? Why are you not walking? Why are you in a wheelchair? You know, these beautifully innocent questions that we ask as children when we are self-centered and we are the center of the universe and we are the gods of our own undertaking. And there's a movement from that into being able to modulate and filter that is necessary for adult living. But there is a fall into that. There is the realization for the first time that the world isn't a safe place. Some children learn this very traumatically, savagely, brutally, awfully. But most of us will learn and do learn that it is necessary to move through the realization and the recognition that the consciousness with which we once saw life, that of the world being a safe and secure place, isn't an appropriate undertaking for adulthood. And of course, what we do as world cultures with people that do live out of that is we give them labels and diagnoses and sometimes institutionalize them or restrict them from living in such a liberated way. We all do this to some extent in the ways in which we all modulate the degrees to which we are able to be honest and truthful with people. We usually call this politics, don't we? And we know that politicians themselves have a very neat way of modulating and navigating truth with a small t. I'm not sure too many politicians, though some, as wisdom teachers, and some are dedicated to great truth and are able to express that. But they seem to be fewer and fewer just now. But only will our politics move out of the traumatization of its own undertaking that it's embittered on itself by perhaps coming to a way in which it can express a greater truth that might come out of the collapse of its own structures and institutions. We shall see, shan't we? They seem to be falling away now. And out of that global collapse of the ways that we've had, out of the collapse of economics, out of the inevitable rise of the right and of the ceiling of the capitalist agenda and the neoliberalism of that, will inevitably be its own downfall, because success is the genesis of failure, just as failure is the genesis of moving towards success. And there's a trauma in the movement of that, or there's certainly a movement of that which is an energetic undertaking that sees the next come to pass. And you've only got to look in the media, you've only got to look at the world and the energy that's around right now, that which we would call global trauma, the collapse of the environment, the beginning of the rise of the limits of accumulation and success addiction and safety addiction and comfort addiction that is falling apart, to see that out of the collapse of that and the difficulty that we will go through will rise the next thing. I'm not going to begin to articulate what that might look like, but we hope that it's something better, or we hope to move beyond hope itself. Hope isn't the opposite of hopeless, but hope-free. Perhaps we can move closer towards a hope-free undertaking. Regardless, there is the individual trauma, there is the collective trauma, there is the generational trauma, there is the difficulty and there is the day in which we live and inhabit. And sometimes on any given day, that which we call trauma and difficulty can come to us and visit our door. But just know that in the end, difficulty, suffering, trauma, complexities, and the inevitable suffering of life, the essential suffering of life, do belong to a narrative that is something good, and that out of which we can broaden the way in which we experience life, ourselves, the world and the people in it. And in the relative undertaking of each of our days and moments, we can come to a place where we can think and feel and offer a broader sense of our own place in the world. And we can embody what we might call trauma, or what we might have called trauma, in order to be a better offering into the lives of those still experiencing that very same phenomena.